Good afternoon and welcome to this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. I'm Jim Scott, President and CEO of Applied Policy, a health policy and reimbursement consulting firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. This month, we are, of course, in the final days of the Biden administration. And as one group of policymakers is preparing to leave town or at least change jobs, we're learning more about what the Trump administration will look like. Today, the Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum is pleased to welcome two Republican insiders who bring their perspectives on what to expect in the coming months. I'd like to introduce veteran Washington lobbyist Brett Baker from the Nichols Group and Diane Major from the D. Major Group. Together, they have worked in virtually every setting in Washington that shapes healthcare policy. Diane, let me start with you. Can you tell us a bit about your background, what you bring to the table as a healthcare lobbyist, and what points of view you represent through your work?
You bet. And thank you for the warm welcome, Jim. Glad to be here with Brett and the Applied Policy team. So folks know on the Zoom, I've always been a big fan of Jim's. He and I got the pleasure of working together in the Senate while I was on the Republican leadership team working for Senator John Kyle of Arizona. And our first, well, I would say I would go to him many, many a time for different legislative drafting concepts. But the big crescendo moment was when we were both working on the Medicare Modernization Act in 2000 and maybe 3 or 6. My memory is a little foggy on that one, but that was the legislation that introduced the Medicare Advantage concept, as well as a drug benefit under Medicare Part D. So I've always been a big fan of Jim's. Since then, I went downtown to go work for a couple of different consulting firms. In 2013, I decided to go on my own and open my own shop. About a decade or so later, we have been representing a plethora of healthcare clients, ranging anywhere from life science to large health systems, supply chain, and even commercial payers. So quite pleased with the round of support and what we're able to do for each of them. Give you a little bit of a tangible example of what we do at the D Major Group. Previously, I did work for the American Hospital Association. So a lot of times we are asked to help on payment policies, most notably Medicare, but dabble in a little bit of Medicaid as well. Some of those niche issues extend to appointments by the executive branch and perhaps on the HHS Quality Summit. We will also be asked to handle even smaller issues, maybe perhaps for a pharmaceutical company that found that many of its products were being counterfeited. And so we would work with the FDA on some appropriations language to mitigate those instances. And then big, bold concepts. We have one client in particular that was an early pioneer under the ACA and wants to layer on top of it its Medicare Advantage expertise. So it can go from the small to the large and everything in between. And for over 11 years, we've been pretty successful. So Jim, maybe I might kick it over to Brett. If you have any other questions, let me know.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So Brett, you have in-depth experience on Capitol Hill. Can you tell us about the impacts of your work and who you represent?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jim. And first of all, let me also say thank you for the invitation to join the Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum for this session. Like Diane, a big fan of Jim and his team at Applied Policy, have known him from some time and had the opportunity to work with the team here at the Nichols Group through our existing relationship. So really pleased to be here, pleased to be with Diane, a longtime friend as well. So really looking forward to doing this session, and I again appreciate the invitation. So I had got my start in Washington, D.C., actually working for the American College of Physicians. So on physician, largely payment issues, representing internists. And a lot of my work at the time was in the regulatory side. So working with CMS and with private payers and the physician fee schedule and kind of promoting the concept of medical homes. I kind of given up on the idea that I was going to work on the Hill. Come 2010, 11, Republicans took back control of the House. I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to go to the Ways and Means Committee, and primarily they wanted someone at that time who knew the physician payment world to work on that issue of kind of addressing the sustainable growth rate problem and the longstanding kind of issues in physician payment. Of course, it involved much more than that. One of the things that I said I thought I was we're glad to be on the Hill and then I have to read regulations anymore. That turned out not to be true. As you all know, a lot of, I was like, well, about half the meetings that come in on the Hill are related to the regulatory process and what, CMS and others may be doing. We got to work on a range of issues at Ways and Means beyond physician payment. From there, had went over after about 5 years to the Senate Finance Committee and worked in the Finance Committee on primarily Medicare policy, but in 2020 got to serve as the health policy director for the Finance Committee staff, then under Chairman Grassley. And all those roles, have got a broad experience across the Medicare payment systems, initially with physician payment as kind of the first area kind of expertise, but expanding to other things. And then under Grassley, when he took over chairmanship from Senator Hatch, really wanted to work on prescription drug payment reforms, and a lot of some of the things we had worked on at that time, with Senator Wyden as the ranking member, didn't make it across the finish line. Some of those pieces kind of were picked up and then done in what ended up being a kind of reconciliation policy way on the Democratic side, which supplemented some of the things that Senator Grassley was willing to do, and most notably the government negotiation process. But through that great experience, fortunate to have working with a lot of the colleagues that are still on the Hill today in key positions, we are able to, as the Nichols Group, kind of do the range of activity from kind of going up in line lobbying on bills to like strategic advice. And I think we can bring that kind of experience to helping folks navigate what does the process look like that the staff and members go through to kind of bring these policy ideas and priorities to fruition, including interaction with like the technical assistance side that well, and this Congressional Budget Process Office or process. So we were also represent a range of providers at the Nichols Group. We have other folks here that have experience in defense and energy and other policy areas that have a different set of clients. The firm's about half healthcare, but it's a group of about 10 people that can help each other across their issue areas as that need arises. So I kind of said I came to the Nichols Group about 3 years ago. What really kind of enticed me about it was that kind of reminded me of like the Hill and the Hill structure, especially at the committee, where you have the opportunity to have your own area of expertise, kind of focus on healthcare issues, but pull on other people who can kind of help or have their perspective or their contacts from other areas and kind of work collectively as a team. So definitely pleased to talk about that experience and some of the insights we've gained and the conversations we have and the questions that I think will come up about the rest of this year and into next. So thanks again for having me.
Thanks. So let's first talk about the presidential election, and then we'll turn to Congress. Brett, let's stick with you for a minute. What are your key takeaways from the presidential election?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting in the sense that healthcare hadn't become a major focus of the the election, and maybe in ways it wasn't a policy heavy kind of discussion. It was a lot of kind of personality and direction at the presidential level anyway, and then kind of how that kind of reverberated through through the congressional races as well. I think, that the economy certainly is always at the top of mind, and I think is lingering concerns about inflation and other and how far the like money goes, and just that interest in a change overall, from the party in the power, which I think was unique in the sense that that you could say, oh, we have a sample of what it was like under a first Trump administration, now under a Biden term, and with Harris taking that mantle. But I think that the election results were fairly decisive in that regard. I think you see it across the Congress. The Senate going to the Republican hands was expected with a lot of a difficult map for the Democrats to defend, and some of the national kind of and statewide trends, but also still a very narrow ends up majority in the House. But I think the takeaway is that with that comes the opportunity in healthcare to do things through the reconciliation process that we'll discuss, and I think the other priorities that probably are continue to be bipartisan, will kind of carry over for what was a focus this year through committee work and other activity that just likely does not get across the finish line this year. So I think the big takeaway is the unified Republican control, and at least in the congressional side, what that unlocks through the reconciliation process, and the opportunity maybe to do that twice even in a single year, which will dominate. And then I'm sure we can talk more about what might happen on the administration side as well. But I'll stop there.
Thanks. And Diane, what are your key takeaways from the election?
Well, I think Brett, captured it perfectly in the sense that if there was a theme of Republican majority in both branches, legislative as well as administrative, and the integration or the coordination that will be occurring between the two. And so if there was thematically one item that kind of came through from the election results, it would have been the economy. It would have been deficit spending, national security. I know you've got some time carved out to really delve into healthcare leadership and what we might be seeing there on that front. I would say, though, that those three issues probably were the predominant ones as opposed to healthcare in previous presidential election cycles.
Great, thank you. And Diane, can you tell us what you expect some of the Trump administration's key healthcare priorities to be?
You bet. And we've been doing kind of a great homework assignment. And we've been studying just some of the policies that went through in 2017 when the first Trump administration came in, and drawing conclusions with some of the rulemaking that occurred over, or I would say first during that administration, his time, and then some of the items that were carried over during the Biden administration, and what ends up kind of bearing fruit in a second Trump administration. So almost like a three-part process. And to answer that question, I think we're going to see a revisiting of healthcare price transparency. Most notably, you'll might hear that I use the word or the term healthcare as opposed to hospital. It will be an across-the-board transparency moment. For example, going back, it was the first Trump administration that did initiate price transparency rules. Beginning next month, hospitals have to start reporting on those. They have been reporting to some degree, but it's not been the level of information that will soon be required next month. And then looking at my notes, I apologize, I'm just looking just to make sure, but hospitals have to start posting the average expected payment for negotiated rates in January. Now, looking back, Secretary Azar, President Trump's first HHS secretary, called for transparency amongst pharmaceutical manufacturers, health plan payors, as well as health systems. So given that the Biden administration had the HHSIG last month issue a report on what's not being identified and what's not coming under the shoppable term, I think we can expect a second Trump administration to maybe dig into that HHSIG report and say, what can we build on? Give you some other examples. Again, I don't want to get too far into this because I know you've got a segment here on CMS nominee Dr. Oz, but you will see more attention given to Medicare Advantage. Is there a different way in which we can take that program? I know there's been a lot of scrutiny about it in terms of some of its program costs, programmatic costs, but are there ways in which we can better manage a patient or a beneficiary that might have comorbidities in the plural? And you'll see some attention given to that. So I want to keep everyone here on the phone or on the virtual Zoom and not give away our goodies that Brett and I have stored up to chat further about. But I think you'll have a lot of maybe past as prologue type of moments here. And you'll see some of these items that were initiated in 2017 get resurfaced again in a second administration.
Thanks, Diane. Brett, anything to add to that list?
Yeah, I agree with Diane on the kind of thought exercise and that preview and transparency and competition continuing to be the themes, and she hit on some of those specific issues. I would just also mention, I think, and this probably happens routinely with administration changes, but like the initial phase will be kind of overturning things that they don't like that the previous administration had done as well. So I think there's, some of that is just kind of like pure kind of policy disagreement. Some of that is, maybe different gradations on the same policy. So I think you see this, probably the usual things, starting with kind of like reproductive health kind of changes from the typically swing with party to, things like, potentially kind of pulling back on things like the requirement nursing Medicare, staff ratio, minimum nursing staffing ratios in nursing homes, for instance. So I think there's that. There's also maybe, things that the previous administration had started but hadn't finished, that maybe the Biden folks didn't, completely disregard, but maybe didn't do their own way, like for devices, Medicare breakthrough payment for, breakthrough devices, that wasn't as kind of robust under Biden. I think some of these things will kind of compete for time and attention kind of out of the gate. As we know, kind of like going back through the rulemaking process, the pullback rules that are already in effect that you don't like, by reproposing their withdrawal versus kind of freezing them if they had more recently been done, and for the ability of the Congress to kind of apply the Congressional Review Act to kind of pull them down through a straight majority vote in both chambers legislation. So I think you'll see, kind of that mix of staking out what priorities are, as well as kind of rolling back on the previous administrations. I think some of the other things I think that are a little bit more on the wild card side probably are dependent on somewhat on the personnel that do get have been nominated, and if they are approved type thing. So I know we'll get into that, but agree with Diane, but also wanted to flag the kind of pullback and rollback of or do differently than the current administration.
So let's turn to Congress. Brett, what will the new composition of Congress mean, and what do you think its priorities will be?
Yeah, so I think it's, in the House, right, you'll still continue to have the leadership will have a lot of the same challenges that exist today on, the very difficult task of keeping essentially everybody in the party on the same page. And, it will continue to be a challenge. But I do think that think of it as like two different phases. One is that reconciliation phase. And that's what we've already heard that would be out of the gate would be, the priority. And like I said, possibility of two reconciliation bills. And just quickly on that process, it's where ultimately the Senate can pass a bill on a majority with a simple majority vote, but they need to adhere to special budgetary rules that the policies have to be budgetary in nature and increase or decrease spending. A very elaborate process on starting with a budget resolution that's agreed to by both chambers, instructing a variety of committees to hit certain spending or deficit reduction targets. So there's certainly a lot of steps and a lot of the coordination that Diane referred to that needs to happen between House and Senate. And typically the House, which still, of course, is always a majority of vote. So if they're aligned, they can say like all these things we want to do, we can do. There's always some historic grumbling about the Senate and its silly rules, but I think in the end they know they need to be in compliance with the Senate rules to see something signed into law. So I think the first kind of through this reconciliation process, there's talk just yesterday in the Senate about Senator Thune said, will be the leader on the Republican side, said that they would start with some of the president's border, campaign promises like related to the border and national security and defense and energy, and then do a second bill that would be focused on extending the tax, the expiring tax cuts from 2017. So even I saw, I think Chairman Smith on the Ways and Means said that why wouldn't you do tax first? So I think there's already some natural kind of disagreement, but it illustrates kind of the complexity of that process. And then with that, like what healthcare could go along with that. I think there's the things that Republicans may like to do that would be significant and maybe in like kind of a site neutral payments type of way, not paying more for services in the hospital or the AC than they do in the physician office. Certainly that has been a topic of discussion and great debate for some time. I think that the question about is like realizing how hard it is to do this reconciliation process. And if healthcare is not the leading piece to it, how far down that road do you go in trying to bring that to fruition when it'll be kind of hard to put those puzzle pieces together. But with that, there's opportunities to move policy pieces that may not be controversial. So I'd say long answer way of saying like the first kind of focus would be on reconciliation, largely not a healthcare focused exercise, whether it's one or two processes, bills that are just very complicated to maneuver through both chambers. But then I would say like the leadership, like the leadership, like we'll expect next week would be for the committees that we don't yet know who might be the chair. Like it's primarily the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's I think Mr. Guthrie is the current Health Subcommittee chair is expected. Is largely thought to be the favorite to win that. But I think regardless, I think you likely see a lot of the continuation of the policies that have been a focus this year as well. And, that would be, transparency that would be aligned with the administration, pharmacy benefit manager reform as a couple of the big items. And that, a lot of committee activity on those issues, House and Senate this year. They haven't been able to move a lot of those pieces into law. And I think you have those like come back to those next year as, continuing to be priority issues with a lot of like legwork that's already done and things that were done in a bipartisan way. So you have like the purely partisan, reconciliation that can include healthcare stuff, may be difficult to do that. And then I think, coordinating with the administration on its priorities and healthcare, but also kind of revisiting things that have been a big focus this year that don't get across the finish line.
Thanks, Brett. Diane, anything to add on the composition of Congress and congressional priorities?
Well, so for everyone here on the Zoom and your viewers, right now we're looking at a House makeup of 220 Republicans to 215 Democrats. They called the California 13 race last night, and that was the final race that was pending as votes got tallied. And it makes for a very, very tight, slim margin. for Speaker Mike Johnson for the House. So I think as they go into next year and they start the new Congress, the 119th Congress, Speaker Johnson will have a one-seat majority because you still have two House Republicans from Florida who will be joining, I'm sorry, who are leaving the House. We had one who retired, and that is Congressman Gates, so he's no longer, and then you'll have
I'll let you
another
cover that one, Diane.
Yeah.
Good situation.
Let me just jump in on that one and mix it up here on the Zoom. And then we've got Mike Waltz, also from Florida. So they'll have a special election April 1st for that. So, I'll just lay my cards out here on the table on the Zoom, and I would just say it's for our business, the D Major Group, but actually for a Republican, it's the best of both worlds because it's a very, very slim majority. And what does that mean for the Republicans? They do get the gavel, and we do not get embroiled in another impeachment moment where that sucks the oxygen out of the room. And so it's not a large mandate. It is in an indirect way divided government. And the slim majority does require that the entire conference be unified. As Brett mentioned, these reconciliation measures come to the House floor for a vote. So the moderate wing of the GOP party and the more conservative wing of the party do have to finally, maybe they break bread, maybe they get together, maybe they're in the back room playing cards or having a beverage, but finally trying to figure this out and where they go together and unify that voice. I would love to be a fly on the wall in many of those moments, but it is a way in which you move product that does not get too nutty, and it goes over to the Senate side, and we have a new Senate Majority Leader, John Thune from South Dakota, who used to be in the House. He is now in the Senate, and he knows how that chamber works and has a sensitivity or an appreciation for it. So again, I'm kind of excited about it. I don't think we end up seeing big, bold legislation that just swings from the pendulum from one side to the other. And I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit more of a normalcy moment and some calm.
Thanks, Diane. And during the COVID pandemic, telehealth gained widespread use and has continued since. But the authority of physicians to use and others to use telehealth visits for people with Medicare expires at the end of this year. Do you think that policy will be extended, or will it be allowed to expire? You want to go first, Diane?
Oh,
then we'll see what Brett thinks.
Sure. Brett might have more expertise for his Medicare Part B background. He was my go-to person as I would ask many of these questions, but I think, let me just throw out a little bit of a provocative answer. First of all, I hope it does, and I think it will. However, the DEA, when it did release its extension for Schedule 2 telehealth visits until next year, that might have taken a little bit of pressure off. And I always thought that that was in the driver of extending these telehealth flexibilities. So Brett, correct me where I'm wrong, maybe punch holes in that thesis. But I do feel as if I don't know, the gas was kind of stepped off there a little bit because of the Schedule 2 issue.
Brett, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. And I think all those pieces are important, and the different kind of services that were provided, but through telehealth that have a different regulatory structure. I think that there still is, even related to on the Medicare side more directly, some concern about duplication of services, the ease at which maybe there is abuse. and how telehealth to be, delivered, billed, documented. But I do think that that there are enough supporters, and that has been done and allowed for some time now, kind of going back, I guess it's 4+ years now, that it's thought to be something that would be hard to do without. So I would be optimistic that there's the extension of the telehealth as a kind of extender, and other healthcare extenders that touch a variety of different areas, hospital payment, physicians, certain things that kind of get the status of must do. So I think telehealth is probably up there, you know, and that duration, and we can talk about like what might get done through the rest of this year, but that duration of that will, it largely rides with kind of the other policies. But there could be, I think Congress have extended it, the teleflexibility to Medicare for at least in a year increment, sometimes 2 years increment since the public health emergency expired. So I think they're still kind of figuring that out. One of the challenges is some are still concerned about potential for abuse. There's still CBO's not sold that it that it doesn't increase costs, and some of that can be good, and that more services that are needed that can be provided. Some that can be potential duplication of services, but it's something that many would say like, oh, this should make healthcare more efficient, but CBO is not quite there yet. So there's a cost involved, but I do think it gets extended. I think it's kind of up there in the near must do category, and that there's a lot of enough bipartisan support to make that happen, and that you won't see a disruption. One of those quick mention, and I think like so is the Medicare telehealth flexibility, is the DA piece that Diane mentioned. There's also like starting through and then the pandemic was an allowance for high deductible health plans to count like telehealth kind of without meeting the deductible, and that those services could be paid by plans. And that's more of a Republican thing than Democrats. I think Democrats have view it as potentially the way to kind of circumvent more, or at the detriment of more robust coverage. But it's been something that's kind of ridden along with other telehealth extensions. And I think that my view is that like those who don't love it go along with it, but there's always like a back and forth of that. So that's a potential complication. But again, I think that the telehealth flexibilities do get extended.
Right. Thank you. So let's turn to some of the personalities that have been in the news lately. President-elect Trump has put forward RFK Jr. To be Secretary of Health and Human Services, and suggested Dr. Oz to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Diane, do you think they'll be confirmed?
I do.
How about you, Brett?
I do as well. I think Dr. Oz has a more kind of straightforward path, but I think they're both confirmed.
Brett, are there any other nominees in the healthcare space that you think we should be watching?
Yeah, I think that the others that have been identified or nominated, are likely to also get confirmed. NIH and CDC, former House member, as well as FDA. So I think that those, I mean, there's a lot of latitude to the idea that the president, gets to pick his cabinet and his key people. I don't know how many Democratic votes that those get, but I think there's you'll see those. I don't expect trouble on the Republican side, and the Republicans have enough to confirm them with the majority in the Senate. And I do think there's like some of the when you go beyond healthcare, and the senators are looking at all the selections in total, and we've already seen Diane alluded to Mr. Gates kind of fall off the radar, and others now, a DEA nominee had withdrawn, and there'll be scrutiny of some others outside the healthcare space that I think has an effect of making it harder, and to kind of the senators have to kind of make a decision individually, collectively about how disruptive to the, president's agenda, personnel and possibly the policy agenda as these things can drag on that they want to be. So I think they take that as, in my experience, being there and involved in some of the past. I think the senators take it very seriously, but I think they have to kind of consider the big picture dynamic as well.
Thanks, Brett. And Diane, we've heard the phrase "Make America Healthy Again." Can you shed some light on what that means and what RFK Jr. and Dr. Oz and the other nominees are going to do to make that happen?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, this is a new term for me as well, but the premise of the movement, I am from Wyoming, and so out west, you know, it is an issue that runs deep. And I think after Mr. Kennedy was first nominated, Governor Polis from Colorado came out endorsing that nomination. And so, as Brett mentioned, Dr. Oz probably has a straighter line for maybe an easier nomination hearing and appointment. RFK Jr. might have a little bit of a rockier path, but if you look at going back to Governor Polis's first jumping out on Twitter, I guess now called X, he bear hugged RFK's mantra and this movement of make America healthy again. Now, a lot in the public health space have poked holes at it and raised a few concerns. But if you think about that kind of nutrition, that more holistic approach to living through diet and exercise, try those first before you get prescribed a GLP-1. That runs deep out west, and it runs all the way down from the Pacific coastline, from Oregon down through California. You see it in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah. I went to school at the University of Utah. So region-wise or geography, this is a big movement. And doing our research on RFK Jr. and what does MAHA mean, you see a lot of enthusiasm. And maybe going or taking us back to your very initial question, Jim, about an election takeaway. I, had a lot of family members that confided early on and saying, things like, I don't know if I can vote for Mr. Trump, but RFK Jr.'s got my vote. And at the time, that's when he was on the Democratic platform. So there is resonance here with this movement. I think taking it a little bit further, a lot of that will be explored and examined further during his his private meetings with members in the Senate. Unlike the House, Senate does have nomination authority. They are the ones where they have been granted the ability to make these appointments. They are the ones that vote on them. They are the ones that bring the appointments to the floor and give the green light. So I think there will be a heavy amount of conversation with what does RFK bring to the equation here on this, and what does he do? I think the real curious factor will be more along the lines of who are the deputies that are slotted in, the tier 2, the tier 3, the tier 4 even for HHS.
Thanks, Diane. And Brett, what can we expect from the hearings? For example, what kinds of concerns do you expect senators to raise with RFK Jr. that he's going to have to explain in order to get confirmed?
Yeah, so I think it's like the process for those confirmation hearings, and you read about this now, is like the nominees will go up and meet with the individual senators. So they have that opportunity to kind of have, if they're not known to each other, to have that kind of meeting and discussion in private first. There's a lot that goes in, and for example, Mike's Anderson Finance Committee, they bring the nominee before the staff even. So the committee staff gets to sit with the nominee, and then the all the offices that are on members of the committee get to sit with the nominee and ask questions as well. So there's a lot of that prep that goes into that. I think that benefits both sides to that. I think that, in the Diane's point, there's a lot that I think that's part of the kind of MAHA agenda that makes sense. Diane, I was looking for your hat in the background if you had the MAHA hat, but yeah, like better purity of food, focus on chronic conditions, how to address underlying conditions. I think that there's also then you get into the more where there's been more concern, and some of it is, related to the issues of like vaccines. And I think the current kind of posture seems to be, that there would be transparency in like the vaccine data and kind of everything kind of associated with it, as opposed to, something maybe further than that. Also on like kind of corporate influence in medicine and how that translates into FDA user fees and things like that. So I think they're, are fluoride in water, and so they're the things that maybe, are that most people could probably agree on. Then there's things that there'll be questions on. I think also from a lot of it will come from the Democratic side. I think, and there may be, personal history pieces that always come up, or can come up. But also, I guess the one thing maybe on the Republican side that I suspect that they're talking about, at least in closed doors, would be kind of RFK's Jr.'s position on abortion issues, which I think for some, that he will play a role in a lot of those decisions that are made at the HHS level on policy matters, and I think that'll be on the Republican side probably. Something that they'll explore further. But I think by the time that they actually have those hearings, there's certainly some theater to them. But I in my experience, you don't typically get to like a got you moment in the hearing that can like kind of sink the nominee per se. And a lot of it's pretty choreographed in advance. But it will be, and not to diminish the interest in the viewing value of all that, but I think just because the process affords so much opportunity for back and forth in the lead up that you don't always get those fireworks.
Thanks, Brett. So Diane, let's talk about separating opinion from what's real and possible. So following the election, what has the mood been here in Washington and among your clients?
Great question. So I would separate the sensational headlines in in the press from maybe perhaps more doable. And I'm going to use Dr. McCary, the FDA commissioner, as an example. We can also talk further about Dr. Oz too, but we'll go on. I'm kind of curious about, and I saw this a little bit play out with Dr. McCary in the sense that the Brown University Dean of Public Health, Dr. Jha, came out and endorsed him. But then you see, and that was an early on kind of, I don't know, bipartisan, likable moment. And the purpose of his endorsement was more along the lines of, I do think, or he thinks, he thought that the FDA was too heavily reliant on non-binding guidance, that the agency was overstepping its bounds compared to the actual authority that Congress had granted it. Also remember, keep in mind, you have a Supreme Court case with Chevron deference that was decided on last cycle And so there will be a discussion here about what have these agencies been granted in their pure authority and what keeps getting overstepped. So we hear a lot, wake up today, and you would have thought that Dr. McCary, I don't know, the worst possible nominee. And I keep wanting to point back to, but Politico, did you remember the story that you ran about 3 weeks ago about Brown University endorsing him? And again, not Brown University itself, but the dean of the public health department. So there is a lot of I think across the aisle interest in what some of these nominees can bring to the table. Uh, there has been some concern for a long period of time about NIH. Why do we need 27 different research institutes? There's legislation that's been introduced for a couple of years now saying, hey, maybe we could have that. Do we take it down to 12? Do we take it to 15? Maybe we just land at 18, don't know. But has that agency kind of gone above and beyond its initial charter? So that's where I separate some of the real from the, I don't know, sky is falling moment. Wake up this morning, I think everyone's going after Dr. Oz for promoting GLP-1s and the obesity drugs. Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think maybe a week and a half ago, the Biden administration issued a proposed rule providing Medicare coverage for those. And that stems from the Senate's initial 2017 Chronic Care Act that was now, or that was subsequently signed into law in 2018. So I'm not sure where and how that became, I don't know, a gotcha moment, because just a week and a half ago, the Biden administration was applauded for maybe moving the needle around obesity and what we can do to bring down diabetes rates, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I start to say, separate the wheat from the chaff, do a little extra reading. Maybe it's an AI generated article. And if you kind of dig in a little bit deeper, you might be able to connect the dots that we might have some really good conversations starting to take afoot.
Thanks, Diane. And Brett, the legislative agenda and changes are going to take time, but once the president's in office, he has control over, rules and regulations. So what are some of the first things we should expect to see out of the new administration on the regulatory side?
Yeah, no, I think that there'll be kind of a flurry of day one activity, and a lot of that's through executive orders, in which if we remember the first President Trump term, he liked to pose with those executive orders, very distinctive signature on them. So and I think as we know, like those really direct agencies to take action. Except maybe in isolated cases, which they can change policy kind of immediately. So to your point, I think, like these, things will take time. There's typically comes in, and I think new administrations put the freeze on things that aren't yet final, and then they can review them all. And I think landing teams to get into departments from the transition there had not, got in as early as in the past for lack of signing kind of the agreement about how that process works. But yeah, I think they'll kind of freeze what's already in process to review that. And then, you'll see the executive orders that, largely are directing agencies to take action. Some of those will be likely related to abortion issues and other things that can kind of pull back on Biden administration policies. The things that really direct kind of specific policy do take more time to kind of work through, typically have like a comment process through the agency as well. So I think they kind of tying that in with the nominees too. I think it really kind of depends on what their what the different departments want to take on as a priority. That's kind of outside of kind of the standard operating procedure as well. So I think that's probably more to be determined. And I think those are areas where there's probably concern from stakeholders about how that plays out. And I think there's the issue too about like, will that, with that be like agencies reduced in size and then capability or different ways to do things at the FDA. I think those things take time, but I think with that, like, there'll be, the priority rules that they might want to resurface, like related to medical devices. There'll be the kind of continued maintenance of these payment systems and the blocking and tackling related to all that goes into that. That's essentially required by statute to, to maintain or to implement changes that Congress had put in place. So I don't see that, there'll be an opportunity to kind of stake out the priorities, some probably known, some not yet known, some time to kind of adjust and participate in that process. But you'll still see the, the continuation of the things that we know, I won't say love, but especially when they dump all those payment rules at the same time. But, I think those processes, still continue, and then with them afford opportunity to engage in changing policy or opposing policy changes and things like that. So I think we see new, but a lot of the same as well. And I think that's, to Diane's point, a lot of the focus is on the kind of the shiny object there, but there'll be changes, but there'll be a lot that is the same.
Thanks, Brett. Diane, is there anything in healthcare policy that I didn't ask about that you think our audience should know?
I do, Jim, and I was going to grade you on it. So, so let's just, one item in particular that I was surprised had not really come up yet on the call. Let's go to the ACA. For example, there has, throughout the election and, at many different times, there is this consternation around the Affordable Care Act and what do Republicans do with it? In particular, at the end of December of 2025, the tax subsidies for enrollment for those over, I think it's 400% of federal poverty level, kind of a high income threshold. And there was some discussion around whether or not those should expire, whether they should repeal them overtly, et cetera, et cetera. And going into the election, there was a big storm brewing that we need to do something on the ACA. I think cooler heads will end up prevailing, and there will be finally a recognition amongst the Republican Party that the ACA is here to stay, and that providers have adapted to it. So, where I do think there might be some changes or adjustments to it might be the halting of continuous open enrollment. Instead, they're going to want to do an annual season, just like the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program, or just like we are being deluged with ads on our TV right now about Medicare Advantage and signing up before the beginning of the year. The ACA will probably say, okay, let's have some consistency there. Let's also, I would move on to a second topic. Let's give recognition that Medicare Advantage does need to be here to stay. There was a desire during these past, I don't know if I would say 4 years, but maybe the past 2 to 3 years, let's go back more to a fee schedule moment and have a part A, a part B, robust set of options under Medicare. And Chairman Bernie Sanders kind of led the charge for that. He was at the time chairman of the Senate Health Committee. And I think there was a desire to provide all the MA services in those traditional Medicare programs. And with Dr. Oz coming in, I think there's a more solid recognition that MA does have problems. There are issues involving prior authorization. Can we use AI for a more efficient moment in approving those claims? And if claims are approved on a consistent basis, why is AI being used to deny or delay approval? So let's reverse that equation and get that care, that patient care, approved at a faster clip. And maybe we reward plans that use AI in a more constructive moment than opposed to a delay or deny moment. So I think there's some exciting stuff that goes on here, but in terms of concrete progress, it is to recognize that MA is the only way that you're going to be able to save the Medicare Trust Fund. Remember, we do have insolvency issues. And maybe also to take a little bit of a different approach, Jim, in your question, what did you miss? We have a big, important department called the Department of Treasury here that will be playing a role in what we do on a deficit side of things. The nominee, Scott Bessent, there wants to grow the economy, and he applies or takes a 3-3-3 vision toward that. 3% growth through tax cuts, 3% with energy production, and 3% with deficit reduction. And so we will be looking at, and I don't mean necessarily we, but I do think it's incumbent upon healthcare providers to say, where can we be additive in that conversation? And where can we bring in some of these more efficient means for delivering care?
Brett, we covered a lot of ground today and we're about out of time, but to sum up, what is the one thing you'd like our audience to remember from our discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I'll say just like quickly, I think not to go into any detail about other issues, and this was like remiss for me not to mention, but Medicaid, I think through the reconciliation process, Republicans will consider changes to Medicaid. They could save money, and then on the ACA, I think there'll be the focus on whether they increase the enhanced subsidies, but also whether there's fraud in some of the eligibility and the application of those tax credits over time. The one thing I'll take away, I think, we kind of touched on this. I think there's, or we touched on it a bit. There's a lot of swirl. There's a lot of things that are, that are controversial, that kind of command a lot of attention, that require a lot of back and forth. I think maybe always happens with, cabinet appointments, but, maybe more so under, President Trump, who can be more impulsive or very happy to shake up the status quo. But with that, as we talked about, there'll be issues that are considered through reconciliation. There'll be the carryover of policy priorities that have been bipartisan. And I think when I was at the Finance Committee in 2016, a colleague of mine there was leaving to go to the administration at the time, and she had given us all shirts that said, "Keep calm." It's blurred out, but keep calm and legislate on. So anyway, I think that can apply to the Congress as well as kind of the regulatory process, that there'll be, different priorities, ups and downs, but, a lot of opportunity for engagement on key and priority issues for all of us. So that's my takeaway. Enjoy the show, but there'll be a lot of opportunity to see policy changes as well.
That brings us to the end of this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. Thank you, Brett and Diane, for expanding our knowledge about what to expect in healthcare policy in the next months. We hope you'll join us for our January forum, where we'll be welcoming 3 members of the media who will give us their take on the unfolding first 100 days of the Trump administration. Before I close, we just sent a message in the chat with links to subscribe to our monthly newsletter and to view our Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum website for more in-depth insights into current and perhaps future healthcare policy. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Applied Policy team and enjoy the rest of your day.